Welcome back to the deep dive. Ever found yourself trying to wrestle with a really old text? Or maybe just trying to pin down an idea like, what does temperance really mean? And it just keeps slipping away.
Yeah, that's pretty much exactly what we're getting into today.
Yeah.
We're looking at Plato's dialogue Charmides.
But not just the dialogue itself, right? We're using B. Jowett's preface to his translation as our main guide here.
Exactly. In Jowett's preface, it's way more than just an intro. It kind of throws open the doors on what it's like to translate ancient philosophy.
Okay.
Plus, it shows you the debate scholars were having about Plato back then, and it sets up the dialogue itself. Socrates searching for the meaning of temperance, or you might say wisdom.
So it's like a two-for-one deep dive. We get the behind the scenes on translation and scholarship, and we track this ancient philosophical hunt for temperance.
That's the idea.
Mm.
We're unpacking Jowett to get that context and following Socrates into the Charmides. It's fascinating stuff.
All right, let's do it. Where do we start? Jowett, the translator.
Yeah, let's start there. For Jowett, translation wasn't just, swapping Greek words for English words. It was much more an art form.
An art form, how so?
He wanted to capture the feeling of Plato, to make it read in English almost like an original work. So I think that gives you the same kind of impression the Greek text might have, not just a dry copy.
That sounds incredibly difficult. More like translating the spirit than just the text. Did he talk about the challenges, the roadblocks he hit?
Oh, absolutely. He lists quite a few, and they really make you appreciate the task. One huge one is just the basic structure of the languages.
How Greek works versus English.
Right. Greek often uses lots of connecting words showing cause, contrast, inference. Jowett calls it adversative or inferential.
Mm.
Modern English often just puts sentences side by side. The connection's implied, maybe.
So you, as the translator, have to kind of build those logical bridges in English sometimes.
Exactly. And you have to do it without sounding clunky. Then there's sentence length. Greek sentences could be these massive, complex things.
Right.
Jowett had to decide where to break those up for an English reader without, losing the flow of Plato's thought.
Plus, I imagine dealing with ancient manuscripts. They didn't have paragraphs and punctuation like we do, did they?
Not in the same way, no.
Yeah.
So yeah, figuring out where one thought unit ends and the next begins is part of the job. It's interpretation right there.
Wow. Any other big ones?
Well, there are subtle things too, like how Greek uses grammatical gender for abstract ideas or objects, where English usually just uses it.
That sounds minor, but I guess it affects pronouns and sentence flow.
It can. It can force you into slightly awkward repetitions in English sometimes. And he mentions relative clauses and pronouns apparently much clearer in Greek because of the case endings.
Whereas in English, we rely more on word order, so ambiguity can creep in if you're not careful.
Precisely. You might have to rephrase or add words to make sure the reference is clear. He also struggled with Greek's comfort with repeating key words.
Oh, right. English tends to prefer synonyms, doesn't it?
Yeah, we push for variety. But Jowett felt that sometimes trying too hard to avoid repeating a word led to awkward phrasing, sort of dodging the issue.
Hmm.
And he makes this really interesting point that our modern demand for precision, for crystal clarity in language, might actually be linked to the rise of logic and science.
That's fascinating, how our whole way of thinking shapes the language we expect. He also mentioned keeping an equability of tone. What's that about?
Basically avoiding jarring shifts. You don't want weirdly archaic words popping up next to modern ones or, say, bits of Bible speak, unless it's for a very specific effect. Keep it smooth, consistent.
And avoid overly obscure words that just stop you cold.
Right. Keep it readable. Oh, and metaphors. They're a classic translation headache.
Because what works in one culture might just fall flat or make no sense in another.
Exactly. Jowett says you often have to paraphrase the idea or find a different equivalent English metaphor, which means, again, making an interpretive judgment call.
But maybe the biggest challenge he flags is philosophical terms.
Yeah, I think so. Because ancient philosophical terms, especially in Plato's time, often didn't have the precise, fixed meanings we might expect now. They were still being shaped.
So you can't just plug in a modern equivalent.
You really can't.
Yeah.
Jowett was very strong on this warning against imposing, say, Hegelian ideas or Darwinian concepts or even later Christian ideas onto Plato. That's just bad history, bad translation.
It forces Plato into a box he never lived in. Anachronism.
Totally. He even argues against rigidly translating a key Greek term like dikaiosun with the exact same English word every single time, like always using righteousness.
Why not? Isn't consistency good?
Context matters more. The meaning or nuance might shift slightly. Sometimes you need a synonym, or maybe even, Jowett suggests, using or in the translation to show the reader there's a range of meaning.
So the translator's constantly juggling, balancing the Greek, the English, adding little clarifications, maybe omitting tiny words, all aiming for something that's faithful but also clear and, well, good English.
It's a tightrope walk, a faithful transcript that breathes like living English.
Okay, so that gives us a real sense of the translator's workbench. But Jowett's preface doesn't stop there, does it? He gets into the scholarly arguments swirling around Plato.
He definitely does. He engages with other scholars of his time, and he doesn't pull punches. For instance, he pushes back hard against attempts to force all of Plato's dialogues into one single, perfectly consistent system.
Like Schleiermacher's approach.
Yeah, that's when he mentions. Jowett sees a common spirit, absolutely, and development in Plato's thought, but not some grand pre-planned architectural system.
He thinks that kind of systematic philosophy maybe hadn't fully formed yet.
That's his argument.
Yeah.
Applying that expectation to Plato is reading history backwards a bit. He's also really strong, almost aggressive about Plato's epistles, the letters.
He thinks they're fakes.
Pretty much. He starts with a general doubt about ancient letters surviving authentically, but his main attack is on the content. He finds them, frankly, trivial, lacking Plato's usual depth and subtlety. He even points out what look like clumsy borrowings, phrases lifted from the dialogues but used awkwardly, almost like someone trying too hard to sound like Plato.
So stylistically, they just don't ring true for him.
Not really. He says they're too like him and also too unlike him. They mimic the surface but betray things like egotism or affectation that the Socrates of the dialogues avoids.
Like a bad forgery.
That's the implication. Plus, he finds historical errors in them, mistakes about people's ages, weird comparisons between Athens and Persia, blunders about Athenian history like the 30 Tyrants.
So combine internal style issues and external factual problems.
Exactly. His conclusion is they're likely later forgeries by some rhetorician, not historically reliable unless confirmed by other sources.
That's a bold stance. He also takes on another scholar, Dr. Henry Jackson, and his later theory of ideas. What was that about?
Right. Jackson's theory was that Plato fundamentally changed his mind about the famous theory of ideas, or forms.
How so?
Jackson argued that in earlier works, like the Republic or Phaedo, the ideas applied to, well, almost everything: justice, beauty, beds, maybe even mud. But later on, in dialogues like Theaetetus or Philebus, Plato supposedly restricted the ideas mainly to natural kinds, like species of animals or plants, shifting his focus from metaphysics towards the classification needed for science.
Wow, that is a big shift. Ditching ideas for abstract concepts. How did Jowett respond to that?
He wasn't buying it. He had several big objections. First, he was skeptical about the main source for this theory, which was Aristotle's metaphysics.
Why skeptical of Aristotle?
Jowett suggested that some parts of the metaphysics might reflect Aristotle's debates with later Platonists after Plato's death, and might not accurately represent Plato's own views, especially since Aristotle sometimes describes the ideas in ways that don't quite line up with Plato's dialogues.
Interesting. So maybe Aristotle wasn't a perfectly objective reporter on Plato's final views?
That's Jowett's caution. But his perhaps bigger point was simpler. Plato himself never says anything like, "Hey everyone, I've totally changed my mind about the forms."
Yeah, you'd think he might mention a fundamental overhaul of his central doctrine somewhere.
You would think. Jowett says Plato talks about different approaches, longer ways and shorter ways to understanding, but never signals this kind of radical break.
Okay, what else?
Jowett also really disliked Jackson's method. He accused him of basically cherry-picking quotes from different dialogues, taking them out of context, and stitching them together to fit his preconceived theory.
Confirmation bias, essentially.
That's the charge. Jowett compares it to finding hidden codes in Shakespeare or mystical interpretations reading into the text rather than from it. He insists Plato has to be understood in his own context.
Makes sense.
He also questions if Jackson's emphasis on classifying natural objects wasn't a bit anachronistic, reflecting more modern scientific concerns than ancient Greek philosophy. And he points out that another major scholar, Professor Zeller, also rejected Jackson's theory, arguing the later dialogues still clearly involve ideas of qualities, relations, actions, not just natural kinds.
So Jowett's overall picture of Plato is one of growth and evolution, maybe some inconsistencies, but not these dramatic breaks or rigid systems.
Exactly. A unified spirit developing over time, but not a technical manual with revised editions.
Okay, that scholarly context is really helpful. Now let's finally turn to the dialogue Jowett was introducing. Charmides, or temperance, where does it take place?
We're in a palestra. Think of it as an ancient Greek gym or wrestling school, the palestra of Taurius. The narrator is Socrates himself.
And he's just back from military service, is that right?
Yes, back from the campaign at Potidea. He runs into some friends like Charaphon and Critias.
Critias, who's the cousin and guardian of the dialogue's namesake, Charmides.
Right. Socrates asks them, what's new? Especially with the promising young men of Athens, anyone notable for wisdom or beauty.
And Critias points out Charmides, who's just arriving, and apparently he's stunningly beautiful.
Oh, yeah. Socrates admits he's always a bit susceptible to handsome youths, but even he is struck. He says basically everyone in the palestra stopped and stared at Charmides as he came in, like they were looking at a statue. The description is quite vivid.
But Socrates being Socrates, he immediately shifts from looks to character.
Instantly. He says, okay, he's beautiful, but does he have a noble soul to match? Critias assures him, oh yes, he's as fair and good within as he's without. He even claims Charmides is already a philosopher and a poet.
Setting the bar incredibly high for the poor guy. And the excuse for Socrates to talk to him is kind of funny, isn't it?
It is a bit contrived, yeah. Charmides apparently has a headache. Critias suggests Socrates pretend he knows a special cure, a charm, specifically to get Charmides to engage with him.
A philosophical intervention disguised as medicine. And this leads to Socrates telling that story about the Thracian charm.
Yes, the physician of King Zamoltus. It's a key moment.
What's the core message of that story? It really sticks with you.
The Thracians' wisdom was this. Greek doctors are right to treat the body as a whole, not just the eyes for an eye problem, for example. But they make a big mistake by trying to treat the body separately from the soul.
Ah, so the mind-body connection, or rather soul-body connection, is crucial.
Absolutely central. The principle is that all good and all evil, for the body and the whole person, originates in the soul and overflows from there. So if you want to heal the body, you have to start by healing the soul.
And the cure for the soul isn't a potion, it's...
Fair words. Discourse, philosophy. These words implant temperance in the soul, and when temperance is present, health flows to the head and the rest of the body.
It's such a powerful idea. Health isn't just physical. And Socrates says the Thracian made him swear an oath.
Yes, a strict oath. Never treat the body part, the head in this case, without first using the charm to treat the soul. Doesn't matter if the patient is rich, noble, beautiful, whatever. Soul first.
So the headache is the perfect pretext. Socrates has his medical reason to engage Charmides in a philosophical discussion about temperance.
Exactly. Critias thinks it's a lucky break. The headache might lead to improving Charmides' mind. And Critias confidently asserts that Charmides already possesses temperance.
Which naturally leads Socrates to say,
well, if you possess it, you must have some opinion about what it is. The philosophical inquiry begins.
Charmides hesitates, right? He blushes, shows modesty.
Yeah, a bit shy, perhaps genuinely modest. Socrates encourages him, saying they'll inquire together. So Charmides takes his first shot. Temperance is a kind of quietness, hesukia.
Quietness or slowness? How does Socrates handle that?
He tests it with examples. Is quietness always good? Think about writing quickly versus slowly, reading quickly, playing music with agility, wrestling, boxing, running, and almost all these. Quickness and sharpness are better than slowness or quietness.
Right.
Since temperance has to be something good, and quietness is often not good, sometimes it's bad, then temperance can't be quietness.
Okay, definition 1 bites the dust pretty fast. What's Charmides' second attempt?
He suggests temperance is modesty, or shame-eidos.
Another plausible idea. How does that fare?
Same method. Socrates gets Charmides to agree again that temperance is always good. Then he asks, is modesty always good? He brings up Homer, who says, modesty is not good for a needy man.
Ah, so if modesty can sometimes be not good, but temperance is always good, they can't be the same thing.
Exactly. Definition 2 is refuted.
It really shows how tricky it is to define virtues just based on common associations. So what's next? The third definition feels different.
It does. Charmides offers. Temperance is doing one's own business. But he admits, a bit nervously, that he might have heard this one from someone else.
Socrates immediately suspects Critias, who's been hovering nearby.
Yep. Socrates calls this definition a riddle. His first attack takes it very literally. He says, okay, if doing one's own business means literally only making things for yourself, weaving only your own clothes, making only your own shoes, never doing anything for anyone else, then a city organized like that would be terribly inefficient. We need division of labor.
Craftsmen, doctors, scribes, they all do the business of others.
Right. And since a temperate city would be well-ordered, temperance can't mean this kind of radical, literal self-sufficiency.
Critias can't let that stand, can he? Since it was likely his idea.
No, he jumps in, basically takes over the definition from Charmides, and argues with Socrates. He tries to refine it.
How does he refine doing one's own business?
He makes a distinction between making something, poien, and doing or acting, pratim. He suggests that doing in this context implies specifically good or beneficial actions. He might be thinking of Hesiod saying, work is no disgrace. So temperance becomes the doing of good actions.
Okay, so a refinement. Temperance isn't just any activity, but specifically doing good things. Socrates follows this path.
He does, for the moment. He clarifies. So temperance is the doing of good actions. And then he asks Critias a crucial follow-up. Does the temperate person know they are temperate? Do they have self-knowledge of their own temperance?
And Critias says.
Yes, absolutely. The temperate man knows his own temperance.
And this leads directly into the fourth and really central definition in the dialogue.
It does. Critias now explicitly states, temperance is self-knowledge. He connects it straight to the famous inscription of the Oracle of Delphi, know thyself.
He interprets know thyself not just as advice, but as the god's way of saying be temperate.
Exactly. He sees them as equivalent. Temperance is that self-knowledge Delphi commands.
This feels like a major shift in the discussion. From external actions to internal awareness, how does Socrates proceed?
He agrees to investigate this new definition, but first he does his usual disclaimer. I don't know the answer myself. I'm just inquiring along with you.
Classic Socrates.
Then he poses the core problem. If temperance, or wisdom, is a science or knowledge, episteme, and specifically knowledge of itself, what does it do? What's its result or product?
Like medicine produces health, architecture produces buildings. What does knowledge of itself produce?
That's the question. Critias objects that wisdom isn't like other sciences. They are sciences of something else. Wisdom, he claims, is unique. It's a science of other sciences and of itself.
A kind of master science.
Sort of. Socrates pushes this. If it's a science of science, surely it must also be a science of the absence of science, a science of ignorance.
Okay, so it knows what is knowledge and what isn't.
Critias agrees. The implication is that the temperate, wise person, through this self-knowledge, knows what they know and what they don't know. And they can supposedly judge this in others too.
That sounds potentially useful, knowing the limits of your knowledge. But Socrates raises a big hurdle here, doesn't he?
A huge one. He questions whether such a thing as a science of science and of ignorance is even conceptually possible.
This is where he uses those analogies.
Yes, the really striking ones. Can vision see itself without seeing a colored object? Can hearing hear itself without hearing an actual sound? Can any sense perceive itself rather than its proper object?
Can desire itself rather than pleasure? Can fear itself?
Can opinion have an opinion of itself? He argues this seems impossible, or at least highly questionable, for things that seem inherently relational, like sight needs something seen, knowledge needs something known. He calls the idea potentially monstrous.
It feels like it violates the basic structure of how these faculties work. They point outwards.
That's the intuition he's tapping into. He says it would take a great man, a profound thinker, to determine if anything truly has this kind of self-referential capacity.
But even if they grant its possibility, just for argument's sake.
Right. Socrates says, okay, let's assume for a moment that this science of science and ignorance is possible. Let's grant that you can know that you know, or that you don't know. How does this actually help you?
What's the practical benefit, the cui bono?
Exactly. He argues that this science of science might tell you that medicine is a science, or that someone possesses medical knowledge, but it doesn't teach you medicine itself. It doesn't give you the content of the knowledge.
So just knowing about knowledge doesn't make you knowledgeable in a specific field.
That's his point. This general science of science couldn't, on its own, distinguish a real doctor from a quack, or a skull general from an incompetent one. To judge a doctor, you need actual medical knowledge about health and disease, not just knowledge about knowledge itself.
Okay, I see the problem. It seems very abstract and maybe detached from practical judgment.
And this leads Socrates to ask Critias the killer question. What good, what profit comes from this kind of wisdom defined as merely the science of science and ignorance?
Critias had this idea, this dream, as Socrates calls it, that this knowledge would lead to a perfectly run city, right? Everyone doing what they know, experts identified, no mistakes made.
Yes, that was the initial hope. If wisdom, as science of science, ruled, everything would be done according to knowledge. Pilots would pilot, doctors would heal, weavers would weave, all expertly. Ignorance would be banished. Society would be perfectly efficient.
Sounds pretty good.
But Socrates points out they've skipped a crucial step. They've assumed that merely acting according to any knowledge automatically means acting well and being happy. Is that actually true?
Ah. Does knowing how to weave perfectly make you happy? Does knowing how to navigate make you happy?
He presses Critias. What specific kind of knowledge leads to happiness? Not shoemaking, not metalworking, not even, Critias eventually admits, the prophet's knowledge of the future.
So what knowledge is it then? What does Critias finally land on?
Critias gives the answer that feels intuitively right. The knowledge that truly makes one happy, or is closest to it, is the knowledge of good and evil.
Boom. And Socrates pounces.
He does. You monster, he jokes. You've been leading me around in a circle. Because the crucial knowledge for living well and being happy isn't just any knowledge, or even the knowledge of knowledge, but this specific knowledge, the science of good and evil.
And why is that a problem for Critias's definition of temperance as self-knowledge, or science of science?
Because the knowledge of good and evil isn't the same as the science of science. Medicine produces health, building produces houses, but none of these activities are done well or beneficially without the overarching knowledge of what is actually good.
So the science of good and evil is about human advantage, about what benefits us. It's not just about knowing what is or isn't a science.
Exactly. It has a specific crucial content. But wisdom, as they defined it, science of science ignorance, lacks that specific content. Therefore, if the science of good is what is truly useful for happiness, then wisdom, as science of science seems, well, useless for that ultimate goal.
Wow. What a takedown. They end up completely stuck.
A total impasse. Socrates explicitly summarizes their failure. He says, look, we made all these generous assumptions. We granted this weird science of science might exist. We even granted someone could somehow know what they don't know. And still we couldn't pin down temperance. The whole inquiry seems to have mocked them.
He sounds genuinely disappointed, especially for Charmides.
He does. He says it's a shame because Charmides is said to have temperance, yet they can't figure out what it is, and their best attempt at defining it made it seem useless for living a good life. He even wonders if maybe he's just a bad inquirer because his gut tells him temperance must be a great good.
It's that classic Socratic outcome aporia, the state of knowing that you don't know. He doesn't give Charmides the definition.
Instead he tells Charmides to examine himself, to trust his own likely possession of the virtue, maybe suggesting that living it is more important than defining it, especially since the definition proves so elusive.
How does Charmides react to all this?
It's quite charming, actually. He says he doesn't know if he has temperance or not, but he feels he needs Socrates' charm now more than ever. He basically pledges allegiance to Socrates, saying he'll follow him, and jokes Critias told him to use force if Socrates tries to leave him.
A light touch at the end of a very intense discussion. Socrates agrees to this philosophical custody.
Yes, and Jowett, in his notes, adds some reflections. He sees the dialogue as maybe representing an early stage where concepts like knowledge and action weren't sharply distinguished yet, leading to some of the confusion.
But he thinks the failed definitions still tell us something.
Yeah, they illuminate different aspects people associate with temperance: quietness, modesty, focus, self-awareness. And he highlights the contrast between the difficult search for an abstract definition and Charmides, the youth who supposedly embodies the virtue without needing the definition.
Jowett suggests having the right ideas, even if not perfectly defined, can still influence character for the better.
Right. And he also gives reasons for why scholars tend to place Charmides, along with dialogues like Lysis and Lysias, early in Plato's writing career.
What are those reasons again?
They tend to be shorter. They follow that Socratic pattern of searching and often ending without a final answer, aporia. They lack some of the more complex doctrines found in middle and later Plato, like the full theory of ideas or the doctrine of recollection. They feel perhaps a bit less deep, more youthful, often focused on conversations with young men.
So this whole exploration, starting with Jowett's preface, really gives you a panoramic view. You see the immense craft and difficulty in just translating these texts.
Yeah, bridging millennia and languages.
And the scholarly wrestling matches over interpretation, trying to map Plato's thought.
The debates about systems, authenticity, development.
And then diving into the Charmides itself, you witness this incredibly rigorous, almost frustrating search for what seems like it should be a simple concept: temperance.
Following Socrates as he takes apart quietness, modesty, doing one's own business, and finally that complex idea of self-knowledge, the science of science.
And ending up with that powerful suggestion that maybe the most crucial knowledge isn't knowing about knowledge, but knowing about good and evil. It's quite a journey.
It really demonstrates the Socratic method in action, relentless questioning, exposing hidden assumptions, revealing complexity, and often leaving you with more questions than answers, but deeper questions.
Definitely no easy definition handed to us, but it makes you think, doesn't it? If temperance involves self-knowledge and maybe knowledge of the good, how do we actually get that? Is it purely intellectual or is it something lived?
That's the question it leaves you with. Does being temperate come first and understanding follows? Or is the philosophical struggle necessary? And if the ultimate knowledge is of good and evil, how do we pursue that, especially when defining even related virtues proves so challenging? It really prompts you to reflect on your own understanding and practice of temperance.